Jumbo, y'all. Welcome back to Cross Pollinating Justice with your host, me, Mija Godfrey. I am the founder and community holder at both Jumbo Books and Jumbo Together. I am incredibly excited today to be interviewing one of my favorite people on the whole planet. Her name is Shannon Wright. Shannon is a native of Houston, Texas, and she has worked in social work, community development, and education. Much of her work has been in faith-based institutions, and her master's thesis from Harvard was on the theological resources within evangelical Christianity for addressing racial injustice. She spent 2 years in South Africa studying the similarities the Dutch Reformed Church, which crafted the theology of apartheid, has with American evangelicalism. She now works in college preparation and consulting. Shannon and I met in Wellesley College in the late 90s when we were both students there. And so I must say, hello, Shannon.
Mija, it's so good to see you.
It's so great seeing you too. And I should tell you all, my children also know and love Shannon. She is their Aunt Shannon. And Shannon actually married my husband and me. She officiated our ceremony. So we go way back.
We have some history.
Yes. Now, Shannon, you
Yes.
and I first bonded at Wellesley over how many volunteer hours we put in at the Wellesley News for you and college government for me. Then we discovered our shared love of the civil rights movement and progressive politics. You went on to pursue justice through education and racial reconciliation in the church, work that took you to South Africa, as I just mentioned. So, can you tell us a little bit about your work there?
Yeah, I had done some work on the role that churches played in the anti-apartheid struggle. So there were churches, Methodist Church, the Anglican Church that allied with the protesters. But I actually found myself drawn more to the Dutch Reformed Church because what interested me most ended up being institutions that were not on the right side of history. I think that institutions that have been proven to be on the right side of history sometimes get a little self-satisfied and they can sometimes coast on their history. And so what interested me most was the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa, which had crafted the theology to support apartheid and was the church that kind of, if you were an Afrikaner, which was a white South African of Dutch descent, you almost by default were part of the Dutch Reformed Church. It was almost a nationalist church in that way. And so I was intrigued by the questions of like, what do you do when your theology has been proven to be so egregiously wrong, when it becomes clear that you've so missed the mark? And I thought that there would be some resonance there with the experience of the white Southern church, which is the context in which I grew up as a Southern Baptist. And and I was always struck anyways by how much Afrikaner culture reminded me of Southern culture. Like it's an honor culture. It's extremely hospitable. Sports are very important. Gender roles are fairly traditional. Religion is very central to life. And there's a little bit of that sense of being under siege. So I felt very at home there. Like even the doilies on little Afrikaner grandmother side tables felt like what I would see when I would go to my grandmother's friends' houses. So my focus was just like, how do you come back from having been so wrong? And there were some people within that tradition who were really working hard at justice and reconciliation and who were trying to grapple with what repentance and restitution would look like there. And there were others who became very pietistic and inward focused, who said essentially, we shouldn't engage the outside world at all. We need to simply be focused on like Bible study and prayer. They had sort of stopped engaging social issues because they felt they had been wrong, or I'm sure there were some of them who felt they had not been wrong, but they'd been defeated. Um, and so they just had become very insular. And I kind of wonder if we'll see the same thing in the US church, in a generation or so.
Well, that's so interesting. How did the people who continued to engage in justice work and try to figure out, where do we go from here? How did they move forward? How did they talk to themselves about what their beliefs were when they were completely in favor of apartheid? And then now seeing that that was actually morally wrong. Like, how did they make that connection and move forward in their minds?
So for some, it was a generational shift. The sort of the born freeze, could see that as, so the born
Sorry,
freeze,
what's a born free? Yeah.
the generation that sort of is born or comes of age after 94, after the first free elections. That generation in South Africa, black and white, is referred to as the born freeze. And so for the born free generation, it was kind of that sense of we didn't perpetuate the originals, or like we didn't create the original sin, but we're still responsible for it. We have a sort of restoration job to do. I think it was a little bit easier for them to say that was that's the sin of my grandparents and parents, and I'm still I still have something to do about it, but it's not what I did. I came up
Hmm.
in this as a child. But even people who were adults within it, for the ones that were really trying to grapple with it, I think they were trying to say, I think for many it was a crisis of faith. Is your whole theology wrong then? What can you save? What can be salvaged? What's true? Um, and for others, it was like this very inward turning, because it becomes this, I think there's a real sense of, I know you no longer trust your own discernment or your own wisdom. And so it's like, all you should be doing is sort of prayer and study and meditation and gathering with the saints, sort of, what we think of as traditional church activities, because that's the right lane for the church, and that part you're pretty sure you got right. Like, so just do that and maybe leave, the social and political realm, to others. And I think there were some who really did come to see, even within that pietistic vein, who thought it was a real mistake to have conflated social and political issues with religious issues. That doesn't mean that they thought that religion can't speak to those things, that it doesn't have a moral voice, but to say that there's one right way to take a religious stance on something. I think a lot of them thought where it went off the rails was this conflation of political beliefs and religious beliefs, that, to be the Dutch party was the national party, the NP. That to be part of the NP was to be Dutch Reformed, the NGK, and to be NGK was to be NP, and that there was this melding of identities. And I think that many of them came to see that as problematic, and to say your political identity and your religious identity might run in parallel tracks, but they ought not to be the same thing.
Okay, so this is really interesting. Now that you're talking about identity, did you do any study or interviews that gave you insight into how people made the change from thinking that, I guess they're saying that God wants apartheid to happen, to, oh no, God thinks that's wrong. Like, it wasn't just when Mandela walked out of the prison. So what got people to start shifting their thinking in that way? If you study that.
Right. So, I mean, for many, it was gradual. The anti-apartheid movement, went, was generations long. And so, for many of them, they would watch people being fire hosed in the streets and be like, that's not what I had in mind. I think for others, it's a gradual process. There were still, I want to be clear, like, it's not like everyone was like, well, we were wrong. You have some people who are really working hard at saying this tradition is valuable enough to save. And I want to fix it. But they were sometimes, dealing with some pretty strong headwinds. I think that there are some people who don't say it publicly because, of course, the dynamic that South Africa has that is different than ours is that their Black majority is a majority. So their oppressed group was the majority, unlike in the US where it's a minority, which means they, to some degree, once they got into power, they could dictate the terms of the conversation.
Mhm.
So in some ways, they're sort of there are conversations that are had there that we don't have here because they can make them happen.
Hmm.
The other thing, of course, though, is that, white people can just decide they don't want to be part of that conversation and live in very small insular communities, and that's what many of them choose to do. That one of the things that I would notice would be people saying, well, look at the state South Africa's in now, look at the corruption in the government, look at the, you know, incredibly high rates of violence, interpersonal violence, random street violence. South Africa, you'll hear is like the most violent country in the world. I think it's not, or that it has the highest rape rate in the world. What it is at the weird intersection of being sophisticated enough to collect statistics on that
Mm.
and having enough sort of inequality and violence that it is a real problem. Like I suspect it is not actually worse than, let's say, like the Central African Republic or Somalia, but who's collecting those statistics in those countries? Like
That's right.
there were people who would quietly in quiet conversations, it wasn't ever something they were gonna say publicly, but would basically say it's not necessarily that we were right, but I don't know that they were totally right either. Or
Mm.
maybe they came along too fast and not enough people had really been groomed for leadership. Um, and they came too far too fast. So there definitely are people who will sort of, who will look at the current state of South Africa and say what you want, but it was better run in the 80s. So
Well, whose fault is that? That people weren't groomed for leadership. Listen, I'm gonna be quiet.
So there's also, I mean, I feel like I should make, while I have so much respect, and there are people I just think are absolute stars over there who are doing, that kind of, who are really working in those theological and social spheres, that there are other people I think who, very much like here, will say things quietly amongst themselves that they would not say publicly.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, what were the similarities that you found, right? Because you were studying these similarities between the Dutch Reformed Church and the Evangelical Christian Church, how they form their worldviews
Mhm.
and how they might in the future shift to different, maybe more progressive thinking.
So I think what I saw in common was very much an emphasis on hierarchy, that both are very, very hierarchical, both in terms of sort of family structure. The father is the head of the family, the mother is under him, the children are under both of them. And that they see God, and this is very much Calvinist theology. This is just sort of classic Reformed theology. God is a God of order, God is a God of structure, and that becomes God is a God of hierarchy. God the Father is over God the Son, God the Son is subordinate to God the Father. Like, yes, they're, in the Trinity, there's this sort of, they all work together and they want the same thing. But, we also have those verses that say things like, the Son who did not consider equality with the Father something to be, held on to, like gives that up and becomes subordinate to him. So there's very much a focus on hierarchy, and that easily lends itself to a hierarchy of the races if you want it to. And they were not unique in this. In many ways, they actually borrowed from Southern segregationist theology because, American churches had paved the way for that in the 1800s. So it's not like they had to create it whole out of whole cloth. They had to make it conform with Reformed ideals because, Southern Baptists are not Reformed, although they kind of are now, but that's a whole, we won't get into Southern Baptist polity. It's real weird. They had to make it conform with that, but it turns out pretty easy to do because of that sort of existing value on hierarchy and the idea that God is a God of order, that he loves things to be sort of everything in it, a place for everything and everything in its proper place.
That is so interesting.
And
I
so
never thought about
yeah,
that.
and so I think that that was where I saw a lot of the commonality, and that when they were politically powerful, they could throw that weight around. And then when they had been discredited and they'd also lost political power, that they became quite insular. And that's why I think, like, I wonder if we will see the same thing. You're already seeing so many people leaving evangelical churches, younger people in particular. Russell Moore, who's was head of the SBC's, I'm going to get the name of it wrong, but like Liberty and Religious Liberty and Ethics Commission. So he was a big deal in Southern Baptist circles. And he said, and I've heard him say several times, he was very vocally anti-Trump from 2015 or 2016 on and got run out. I think he's like in a non-denominational church now or something. But one of the things he said was, he was like, you always had young people coming to you as a pastor saying, I don't know if this is for me. And he was like, and usually what it was they didn't want to do the hard things. They didn't want to take vows of celibacy until marriage. They didn't want to not drink. They didn't want, like, whatever it was that they perceived as like the religious rules. And he said, the young people coming to me now are fundamentally different. These are the kids who bought in the most. These were the kids they never missed youth group. They were at Sunday school. Their Bibles were dog-eared. Like, they really believed it. And he said, and they're coming to me and saying, I believed what you told me. I just question now whether you believed it. Uh,
That part.
because now I just feel like everyone lied to me. And it was really just all about power the whole time. And you could have told me. You could have told me it was just about power because, you know, and he said
The
those
mouths of babes, right?
yeah, and he said those are the people we're leaving. We're
Yeah.
losing. These aren't the people who are just like, I don't want to do the hard things that faith requires of me. These are the people who are like, I was all teed up to do it. I was doing it. Like, and then I looked around and no one around me was doing it. They had all fallen for the golden calf. And I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I guess I just have to leave or find it some other place, but I can't do it here. And so I wonder, like, I know that those churches are worried that they're losing their young people if they will not also have that kind of withdrawal from political life. I mean, but that hinges, I think, to a large degree on whether they get the kind of spanking that the Dutch Reformed Church and community got politically. I think that sort of the strains of Christian nationalism that we see emerging in our politics are going to have to be smacked down strongly enough that it forces people to say, we were wrong and we have to regroup
Right.
and have that be the major thread instead of there's groups of people doing it now. There are great resistors within it now.
Mhm.
Um, they're a minority though,
Right.
or they may, even if they are close to a majority, they're quiet and scared.
Of course, yes. So that's so interesting because you were noting how in South Africa you just had the numerical majority was so much bigger than the ruling class, right?
Right, which was like
Um,
10%, 10 to 15% of the population was white.
wow. And so what we have to do here, it always has to be harder, right? We
Exactly.
actually have to get a majority of people from all different demographics who believe the same thing or close to the same thing, the same body of, let people be,
Hmm.
um, to come together to shift the political reality and the political conversation.
Yeah.
Well, that's easy.
I was
Glad
gonna
you laid
say,
that out for us.
it's a harder thing because the easiest thing is just to say, I'm just gonna tap out and not do it.
Exactly right.
So and there's no real social repercussions for doing that.
That's right. Well, look, I want to ask you about a couple other South Africans before we get back fully into the United States. Um,
Okay.
So, we grew up in a time of full global fascination and admiration of South Africans like Nelson Mandela, Stephen Biko, and of course the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I will mention you personally knew.
We're kind of
Uh,
friends. I mean, we were. He has passed on and gone to glory, but we were kind of friends.
that's amazing. Um, But Nelson Mandela famously said that he is not a saint. And he was specifically trying to stop people from thinking he had some kind of magic wand that could heal
Mhm.
South Africa in a second. But something that I also took from that, from him saying that he's not a saint, is that he's clear that everyone has the ability to create more peace and justice in the world. And, do his words inspire you at all, specifically in light of what we just talked about, in needing to change the reality and conversations here?
Yeah, I think that what I find striking about that quote is that it is simultaneously him saying, please don't put me on a pedestal, first of all, because I will fall. Let me be a flawed human being. And we do this to our heroes, right? Whether it's Martin Luther King or Mandela, that we want to make them perfect because I think it's part of human nature to want something to venerate, but also because then we can say, well, only certain special people who have this extraordinary call on their life can do this kind of work, and the rest of us are just, barely holding it together day to day. That's not our job, right? That's like the anointed. That's the job of the anointed. And so I think what Mandela was trying to simultaneously say, please don't hold me to a standard I cannot possibly live up to, and I will fail. Let me be human with all that that entails. And this is a work of we. This is a collective work of we. Like I think he really believed everyone had a job to play, including the people who had caused harm. Like Mandela became friends with some of his jailers. He invited them to his inauguration. Um, I don't think he would ever have supported the whole like, I don't owe you my emotional labor, Google is free kind of element that has sometimes invaded our discourse. He very much believed that South Africans' freedom was going to ride on all of them doing, doing their part and feeling invested in the well-being of the country.
Mhm.
Um, but I actually, to pivot a little bit, I tend to focus on Archbishop Tutu because he was a reluctant activist. He didn't want to be an activist, but all the activists have been put in jail. And
Mm.
he had a little bit of protection in that he was a bishop of the Church of England, and England was an ally of apartheid South Africa because they were part of the anti-communist bloc. And so the apartheid government kind of understood it would be a bad look to put the Queen's bishop in prison.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't disappear him.
Right.
He has a degree of protection, and he knew that. And so, but he always said, I can't wait till I can go back to doing baptisms and weddings and funerals, because to him, that was the heart of life. We do the activism so that we can have the full life that is represented by weddings and baptisms and funerals.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. Yes.
And he was so delighted when he could go back to that. One of my favorite things about him was that until really he was too ill to do so. If he was in Cape Town, he led the Friday morning, 7 a.m. mass at St. George's Cathedral. And there would be like 8 or 10 people there. I mean, it wasn't even in the main church. It was like in this little nave off to the side. But he looked so delighted when he would break the communion bread and say the gifts of God for the people of God. And then everyone would go across the street to a little cafe and have hot chocolate. And I genuinely think that's the happiest he ever was. Like that to him was his calling. His calling was to be a pastor. But when pastoring looked different because the moment called for that, he was willing to do that. But I think he always kept in mind who he really was and what his real calling. He never confused activism for that was the avenue. It wasn't the goal. The goal
Mm.
the goal was baptisms and weddings and funerals.
Oh, gosh, that's beautiful. We're going to end this episode of Cross Pollinating Justice with Shannon Wright here so that we can pick up with her next week and talk about her experiences with racial reconciliation in the United States. If you loved this conversation and want to keep building your courage, curiosity, and joy, come join us in Jumbo Together. It's a community for parents and educators raising kids who will change the world. You'll get the Jumbo Method, monthly book recommendations, book summaries and reviews, and the kind of support that makes hard work feel lighter. Visit jumbotogether.com. Because while raising change makers changes the world, it also transforms you along the way. We're at jombotogether.com.